On the Eurobarometer data. And we got some interesting results. They were so interesting, so the management of DG Action said, don't publish it. But now, thanks to Felix's work, you will hear the truth.
Thank you very much, Lars. About the previous studies, there are several previous studies, macro-micro evidence. There are those who focus on the time period before the implementation of the euro from 1990 to 1999. There are those studies which focus on the pre-crisis from 1999 to 2008. There are those studies who focus on the crisis 2008 to 2013. And there are those who focus on the recovery. And this is one of our publications which will appear in Journal of Common Market Studies this April. And within this manuscript, which we have sent in for the book to be published together, we will look at the first 2 decades, which has never been done. I'll just hop into the Eurobarometer data and I'll explain a bit about these indicators we use. These indicators, and this is why I will focus on it, these are the ones we have to look at once we want to assess public support for the euro and trust in the European Central Bank. This is the only data available which really is authoritative and which really we are able to understand. This is the data we have to look at. This is going to be the database we have to agree. It's not only agree because it's the data which is around, and luckily the survey was continued throughout the crisis. The question about public support for the euro is as follows. What is your opinion on each of the following statements? Please tell me for each statement whether you're for it or against it. A European economic and monetary union with one single currency, the euro. The respondent can then choose between for, against, or don't know. About the standard EB as such, it covers 1,000 respondents per country. New and independent samples are drawn. Interviews are conducted face-to-face in the respondent's home. A multi-stage and random sampling design is used. This is very cost-intensive, especially because it's face-to-face interview. The quality of the data has to be considered high. About trust in the ECB, the question in the Eurobarometer, in the standard Eurobarometer, and this is what we look at, and this is what we should measure, is please tell me if you tend to trust or to tend to not to trust these European institutions. The European Central Bank. Respondents can then choose between tend to trust, tend not to trust, or don't know. The measure in the national government is as such. I would like to ask you a question about how much trust you have in certain media and institutions. For each of the following media and institutions, please tell me if you tend to trust it or tend not to trust it, the national government. The respondents can then choose again between tend to trust, tend not to trust, don't know. We construct net support and net trust measures according to the following equation. Net support equals the respondents who answer for minus those who answer against minus the complete population. And the same with trust. Net trust equals trust minus those who do not trust towards the complete population, meaning tend to trust, tend to not to trust, distrust, trust, and don't know. And why is this important to take a net support, net trust measure? Because the don't knows, they fluctuate. They fluctuate, especially with the European institutions. We've got don't know response rates of up to 25%. And if you want to compare the measures, net support, net trust, we would need to account for these fluctuations. We also have fluctuations in the don't know, for instance, on public support for the euro. In Italy, the don't knows are quite high. It's 10%. So only taking a support measure in Italy would not be a valid indicator. We would have to filter out the don't knows, and this can be done by a net support measure. And for a pedagogical reason, let's explain what is a net support measure. If we've got, in November 2018, we've got 81% of Germans supporting the euro, 81%. We've got 15% of German citizens who do not support the euro. The net support measure would then be 81 minus the 15. It would be a net support measure in Germany in November 2018, 3 months ago, of 66. Let's hop right into the descriptive statistics. So this is figure 1 of our manuscript. It shows the average euro area 19 situation. We've got on the y-axis on the left-hand side the unemployment, the average unemployment rate, which ranges from 7.3 to 12.1%. On the right y-axis, we've got the net support and net trust measure. It ranges from minus 50 net trust net support to 50 net trust net support. The net support net trust measure is very pedagogical because this is the zero line. Everything which is above the zero line means there is majority support, majority trust. Everything which is below the zero line is minority trust, minority support. Now let's look at the 2 decades. Average euro area 19 and public support, net public support for the euro. And we see that the net public support, this is this time series here, up there. So it's the largest values, and there has always been large majority support throughout the 2 decades since the implementation of the euro in 1999. Net support has always been larger than 30. What we see is a slight decline since the start of the crisis. Here, this is 2008, in net support for the euro on average. And then we see an increase here since the unemployment recovery is taking place. So we see that the unemployment increase leads to a slight decline in net public support, but there's still a large majority, even in times of crisis. Then we see this unemployment decline, the unemployment recovery, and we see an acceleration. And here in November 2018, we have a situation where we've got 55% of net support in the euro area 19 on average. And this is very close to these historical high values here in 2003 of 56%. So 2 decades after the implementation of the euro, we reach historical high levels in net support over the average 19 euro. What about trust in the ECB? In the pre-crisis period, this is trust in the ECB. We see majority trust in the ECB. The ECB loses its majority trust throughout crisis. The unemployment increase leads to a pronounced decline in trust in the ECB. Majority trust in the ECB is lost in 2011, 2012. What about the national governments? The national governments in pre-crisis levels, there was already minority trust. They further lose trust because of the unemployment increase. And then we see this situation, the recovery period. We see that the trust in the national government is made up for. It's higher than pre-crisis levels here in 2008. The ECB, we also see a recovery, but they have not made up for the losses. But still, it's approaching majority trust again. So this is the average situation. More importantly, we also have to look at the disaggregated. A referendum will not take place at the European level. A referendum will take place at the country level. A referendum on the euro will take place at the country level. So let's take important cases. Let's start with the core country, Germany. And the interesting thing about Germany, for the 2 decades, there's always been a majority support for Germany. You can see here, this is slightly above 0 in the beginning, so it's equal share, but there's still a majority. But then we see this steady increase in Germany over the 2 decades. And we see this increase in crisis recovery period. And here we have historical high levels in November 2018 after 2 decades, after the implementation of the euro, where 81% of the German citizens support the euro and 15% are still against the euro. The 15%, they are quite similar to the share of the new party in the national parliament, the Alternative für Deutschland. So we have a small fraction of Germans who are against the euro. Now let's look at the case of Italy. Just hop into that, because there has been discordance about Italy. Why has there been discordance? There has been one article in Economic Policy, Guizzo et al. 2016, entitled Monet's Error. 50 pages of Eurobarometer study. On the last page, in the conclusion, they find, using Pew Research data, that, and that's their conclusion, there has always been majority support except for Italy. Okay. Now, in our article in Journal of Common Market Studies 2016, we have already highlighted that there's always been majority support for Italy. And we also stressed that in the new article in Journal of Common Market Studies in 2019, and we want to stress that again here, and we can see it. This is the zero line. There's always been majority support for the euro in Italy. There has never been minority support, not once. If we extend that to 1990, we would have 3 decades of support. Here we see the 2 decades of support. We see in Italy a situation where we see a declining support from very high levels of support, and the minimum is reached in November 2016. In November 2016, we've got a situation in Italy where we've got 53% of Italians still supporting the euro, and 37 are against it. And then we have 10% don't knows, which leaves us with a net support here in Italy with 16%, which is still sufficient. And this is really important to point out. The Italians always, as a majority, supported the euro. And this is the only authoritative data set. We point that out in Journal of Common Market Studies 2019. We don't have to look at these cross-section, Pew or Ipsos or all these studies. We have to look at the Eurobarometer data because we've got time series data, and they will permit us to compare between countries. We really have to look at this data, and the Eurobarometer data, the data which is authoritative, is clearly highlighting in Italy there's always been majority support. Since November 2016, we find an increase, again, in net public support. We find an increase during the populist government, the new one, from now March 2018 to November 2018. Currently, the net support level in Italy is, I think, around 36. It's 63 versus 27. 63% of the Italian citizens are for the euro, 27 are against. It's 36% of net support here. Just let me state something about Spain and Portugal, because there are remarkable cases. So we see this decline in times of unemployment crisis here and here. In times of unemployment recovery, we see this strong acceleration, a very strong increase of net public support to historical high levels in Spain and historical high levels in Portugal. Throughout the 2 decades, there's always been majority support for the euro in each individual euro area country, euro area 19 country, except very short episodes here in Greece, pre-crisis, in Finland, pre-crisis, in Cyprus, in crisis. Except these 3 very short episodes, there's always been majority support for the euro in each individual euro area country, meaning a referendum would be lost. About this is an update of the Journal of Common Market Studies article by EB 89 and 90. It plots the unemployment rate against net public support measure. And we see in Germany, for instance, this steady decline in unemployment rates and the steady increase in net support measures. This is a negative correlation coefficient by minus 0.84. We see this very nice picture in Portugal. Increase of unemployment leads to a decline in support, and this decline in unemployment leads to a huge increase in support, and this is a negative correlation coefficient of minus 0.98. In Spain, it's minus 0.96. It's a very neat negative correlation between the decline in unemployment and the increase in net support. This is again from the book chapter manuscript, and we compare the net support against the trust in the ECB and trust in the national government. And what we find, especially in the periphery, we saw that there was only a slight decline in Spain in net support for the euro, but we see this pronounced decline in net trust in the ECB and in the national government. We also see this for Portugal, we see it in Ireland, we see it in Greece. And in Italy, the situation was a bit different. We already had very low levels of net trust in the national government, but we see trust in the ECB deteriorate throughout the crisis. Now, what happens in economic recovery? And this is the thing to point out. Let's look at Portugal. We see that in Portugal, the decline in unemployment has led to a situation where trust in the national government has increased. It has made up for the losses, and it's at new high levels in Portugal. And also, we see trust in the ECB has recovered. We see slight recovery in Spain in trust in the ECB, trust in the national government. For the first time, we see a support of trust. We see a recovery of trust in the national government in Italy. We have to see what this means. And in Ireland, we also see a recovery of trust in both. These are the euro area, 7 countries. Let's look at the countries outside the euro area, where we see since the first rescue package, since the start of the sovereign debt crisis in Greece in May 2010, we see a decline in net public support in Denmark. We see it in Sweden. We see it in the United Kingdom, in Czech Republic and Hungary. Overall, this is the average. We see this decline where we had equal shares of citizens who supported the euro before the sovereign debt crisis and those who were against the euros. We see a decline. So there's a large majority of citizens against the euro outside the euro area. One thing in the UK is that the UK, in times of recovery, unemployment recovery in the euro area, we see that net public support has increased again and it has reached higher levels than pre-crisis. Also in Sweden. Let's hop into some econometric results. We also included in the book chapter manuscript. We follow Roth et al. 2016 and 2019, the 2 articles in Journal of Common Market Studies. We estimate support and trust as a function of unemployment, inflation, and growth. We find a co-integration relationship between those, so we don't have to be worried about any bias in the coefficients we will display in a second. We estimate our regressions via fixed effects, dynamic feasible general least square approach. The details of this estimation approach are detailedly explained in both these publications. There's an appendix, a 4-page one, which goes into the details of the econometric estimation approach. Equation 1 is estimated with an Euro area 19 country sample from 1999 to 2018 with a total number of 548 macro observations. So in this book chapter manuscript, we only focus on the aggregated level. In this Journal of Common Market Studies article to be appear in April, we also looked at the micro evidence, which would have been too much evidence for the book chapter. The complete data set which we have built up is based on microdata. So what I did in Hamburg since April 2007, I once more updated the microdatabase until 2017, 2018. It now contains 850,000 individual observations from 1999, taking the Eurobarometers and merging them. And this is very painstaking because they really have to be hand merged. You have to go into every Eurobarometer, you have to find out where are the variables, and you have to pick them. There's a large code behind that, and that is a lot of work, and it needs thorough work because it needs to be done hand-picked. You have to check that, and yeah. So this was a lot of work building up this data set, which is now ready. So we can now use it. The analysis, the macro, differentiates between a pre-crisis 1990 to 2008, a crisis recovery period 2008 to 2018, a crisis period 2008 to 2013, and a recovery period, as I mentioned, 2013-2018. Let's look at the coefficients. So this is the full sample here. Net support for the euro, unemployment, inflation, GDP per capita growth. We get a coefficient, a negative one of minus 1.3 for unemployment. What does that tell us? For the full sample from 1999 to 2018, looking at all Euro area 19 countries, an increase of unemployment by 1 percentage points leads to a declining net support for the euro by minus 1.3. And we see that this is driven by the crisis recovery period from 2008 to 2018, where the coefficient is larger with minus 2.1. We also have to highlight that inflation is always negative, which is according to the theory. It should be. Comparing that, the unemployment coefficient with trust in the ECB, we see that trust in the ECB, we see a larger coefficient, and it's the only significant among the three variables, minus 4.2. So 1 percentage point of increase in unemployment in one of the Euro area 19 countries will lead to a decline in net trust in the ECB by 4.2 percentage points. And we also see that this is driven by the crisis recovery period. Same thing is given for the national governments. We would now like to know what happens here in the crisis recovery period. Do we see different coefficients for the crisis and the recovery period? And so this is the crisis period, 2008 to 2013. We see a slight decline in net public support. A 1 percentage points in unemployment increase leads to a decline of 0.8 percentage points in net support. Here is the recovery period, which means a decline of 1% in unemployment rate leads to an increase of 3.6% of net public support. This is what we see in Spain, in Portugal, as I just showed you in the descriptives. With the ECB, it's completely the opposite. They lost 5.3 points by 1 percentage points of unemployment in crisis times, and the recovery is only 2.2. So they have not made up for the losses since the unemployment recovery. The national governments have made up for the losses because we've got 4.1 coefficient, which is larger than the one in times of crisis. This is exactly what we saw in the descriptive statistics. I now want to wrap up. I want to give you two cases. Why is public support so important? The first case is Italy in 2018, which is a very interesting pedagogical case where we find that public support seems to be very important. And in short, the attempt by the Italian populist coalition government to dismantle euro area cooperation was effectively countered by the popularity of the euro, serving this way as a shield against populism. The situation was as such. The populist government wanted to nominate a finance minister, a euro-critical finance minister, into the euro group as a finance minister, the Italian one. That would have damaged the political glue of the euro group. The Italian president was able to prevent that, and we would clearly argue that is the case because he had political legitimacy, public support for the euro over 3 decades. The French case is Marine Le Pen. On the eve of the presidential elections, she gave up the critique on the euro. We would argue her consultants and the party has been understanding that there is a large majority in France for the euro, so they have given up the critique. The case of the ECB, that's the second case, becoming the lender of last resort in the government bond market. It took the ECB 4 years after the start of the crisis in 2018 to turn into the lender of last resort in the government bond market of the euro area in 2012. The announcement of the president of the ECB in July 2012 to do whatever it takes swiftly resolved the sovereign debt crisis in the euro area. The quantitative easing program implemented from 2015 to 2018, paired with a European investment plan, contributed to the recovery from 2013 onwards. given the loss of majority trust in the ECB, as we could just see, we would argue that the public support for the euro gave the ECB the political legitimacy to act on behalf and implement these policies against strong criticism. And which kind of criticism do we hint at? If we look at the German case, for instance, we see that several German actors, politicians, academics, they had appealed to the German Constitutional Court against the OMT and the Q&E program, as they have argued that the ECB, what it does, goes beyond its mandate. The ECG has rejected both, so both policies were legal, but still the ECB had to do these decisions against the growing criticism, and they had to wait for the ECG to rule. And so public support was one of the bases. In conclusion, we find that a majority of the respondents support the euro in each member country of the euro area from 1999 to 2018 for the first 2 decades. Although the crisis in the euro area has led to a slight decline in public support, the recovery since 2013 has triggered an upturn in support. As the euro turns 20, the currency enjoys historically high levels of support among the citizens of the euro area. We detect a similar, although less pronounced, rise in trust in the ECB. Looking ahead, we would argue that the high esteem in which the euro is held by a persistent majority makes it well equipped to weather the challenges it will surely face in its 3rd decade. Our results suggest that keeping unemployment and inflation at bay, particularly the former, will be important for sustaining public support for the euro and trust in the ECB. And ultimately, the public judges the euro and the ECB on the basis of the economic performance within the euro area. This gives policymakers in the member states an important responsibility to design measures that succeed in enhancing growth and employment. And I thank you for your attention. And these are the 2 papers I mentioned in Journal of Common Market Studies.
Well, thank you.